In the autumn of 1956, Britain and France launched one of the most military successful and politically catastrophic operations in the history of modern warfare. Their forces were winning, their objectives were within reach. Their paratroopers held the canal, their ships controlled the seas. By any conventional military measure, the campaign was going exactly as planned. Then, the phone rang. Not from Moscow, which had threatened rocket attacks on London and Paris. Not from the United Nations, which was loudly condemning the invasion. From Washington, from Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who had commanded the Allied forces that liberated Western Europe just 12 years earlier. The man Britain and France had treated as a partner and an ally, who told the British Prime Minister, in terms that admitted no ambiguity, "Stop, or we will destroy the pound." Within 48 hours, British forces had ceased fire. Within weeks, they had withdrawn entirely. France followed. The canal stayed Egyptian, and the two empires who had dominated the world for a century walked away from the Suez dismissed in a way they would never recover from. Suez is sometimes called Britain's Waterloo, the moment when a great power discovers, in public, in front of the entire watching world, that it is no longer as great as it believed. But it is more than that. It was the moment America formally replaced Britain as the dominant power in the Middle East. The moment Europe learned that its superpower era was over, and the moment a generation of European politicians decided that if they could never again act alone, they had better start acting together. This is the story of how it happened, and how America did it without firing a single shot. To understand Suez, you have to understand what Britain thought it still was in 1956, and what it actually was. The British Empire, at its peak, had covered a quarter of the Earth's land surface. It had commanded the world's largest navy, the world's most extensive trade network, and a global reserve currency trusted on 6 continents. Britain had not merely been a great power, it had been, for most of the 19th century, the great power, the default setter of global order, the guarantor of the international system, the country whose navy kept the sea lanes open and whose currency settled international trade. The Second World War had broken that. Not visibly, the map still showed the empire intact. The flags still flew over colonies from Kenya to Malaya. But financially and strategically, Britain emerged from 1945 a shadow of what it had been. It had borrowed enormously from the United States to fight the war. It owed Washington billions in war debt. Its gold and dollar reserves were critically depleted. It had sold off foreign investments that had once made it the world's banker, and it depended on American goodwill in the form of the Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods system, and the NATO alliance to maintain even the appearance of a great power status. The Suez Canal was the symbolic hinge of what remained. Anthony Eden, Britain's prime minister in 1956, a man who had spent his entire career in foreign affairs and genuinely believed in British power, called the canal our back door to the east. It was the artery through which British trade flowed to India, to the Persian Gulf, to the Far East. It was the justification for British military bases across the Middle East. It was the thing that made Britain feel, still, like a global rather than a mere European power. Then, Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized it. Gamal Abdel Nasser was everything that made the old imperial powers uncomfortable. Young, brilliant, magnetic, and burning with the conviction that the Arab world era of subordination to European powers was over. As Egypt's president since 1954, he had already negotiated the withdrawal of British troops from the Canal Zone, a humiliation Eden had swallowed with difficulty. Now, Nasser wanted to build the Aswan High Dam, an enormous infrastructure project that would transform Egypt's agricultural capacity and serve as the monument to Arab modernization. He needed money. He approached both the Americans and the British for loans. And in 1956, Washington, partly unnerved by Nasser's flirtation with the Soviet Union, partly calculating that supporting Arab nationalism would serve America's Cold War interests better than supporting Egyptian development projects, abruptly withdrew its offer for financing. Nasser's response was immediate and electric. Speaking before a crowd of 250,000 people in Alexandria on July 26, 1956, he announced that Egypt was nationalizing the Suez Canal Company, seizing its assets, taking control of its operations, and diverting its toll revenues to fund the Aswan Dam itself. He had embedded the code word for the operation in his speech. Every time he said the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French engineer who had built the canal, Egyptian agents across the canal zone moved to seize its facilities. The crowd erupted. Across the Arab world, the reaction was the same: euphoria. A European institution built on Egyptian land with Egyptian labor was finally Egyptian. In London, Anthony Edward received the news at a dinner party. His reaction was visceral and immediate. He reached for a historic analogy that would prove fatally misleading. Nasser, he decided, was Hitler. The canal was the Rhineland. And he, Anthony Eden, was not going to be Chamberlain. The analogy was wrong in almost every particular, but it drove every decision Eden made for the next 3 months. And it led him directly into the most humiliating trap in British diplomatic history. Through the summer and early autumn of 1956, Britain and France exhausted every diplomatic option: international conferences, United Nations negotiations, a Suez Canal User Association. None of it moved Nasser. None of it returned the canal. And in late October, Eden and French Prime Minister Guy Mollet agreed on a plan that was either audacious or desperate, depending on your perspective. Probably both. The plan was this: Israel would invade Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum to both Israel and Egypt, demanding they withdraw from the Canal Zone to allow Anglo-French forces to move in and separate combatants. Since Israel had just invaded and Egypt had not, Egypt would obviously refuse. This refusal would give Britain and France their pretext to intervene militarily, seize the canal, and present the world with its fait accompli. The conspiracy was agreed in a villa at Sevres outside Paris between October 22nd and 24th, 1956. British, French, and Israeli officials signed a secret protocol, the Protocol of Sevres, laying out the plan in detail. Eden was so determined to hide British collusion that he later ordered all British copies of the document destroyed. The French and Israeli copies survived. The world eventually found out. There was one enormous miscalculation in this plan. Nobody had told Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower, who was 7 days away from a presidential election, who had spent years building America's credibility as an opponent of European colonialism, and who understood with cold clarity that a European military adventure in the Arab world would hand the Soviet Union a propaganda gift of incalculable value, found out about the invasion from newspaper reporters. He was furious, not performatively furious, genuinely strategically furious in a way that would express itself not through threats or speeches, but through the most effective weapon the United States had ever deployed against a normal ally: money. Britain's military operation was proceeding. On October 31st, British and French airstrikes destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. On November 5th, British paratroopers dropped on Port Said. Royal Marines came in by sea. The Canal Zone was being seized. Militarily, the operation was going almost exactly as planned. Financially, Britain was hemorrhaging. The uncertainty of the crisis had triggered a run on the pound. In the weeks of the operation, Britain lost 15% of its entire gold and dollar reserves, approximately 279 million in a matter of days. The pound was under speculative attack in currency markets. The Bank of England was burning through its reserves, trying to defend the sterling exchange rate. Britain needed an emergency IMF loan. It had already arranged a 561 million standby credit. Harold Macmillan, Eden's Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man managing Britain's finances, called Washington, expecting American support. He had spoken with Eisenhower's Treasury Secretary, George Humphrey, at the IMF's annual meeting in September. He believed he had assurances. He did not. The U.S. Army's War College's analysis of what followed describe it as a financial warfare conducted with three precise strikes. First, the United States blocked the IMF from releasing Britain's 561 million standby credit until a ceasefire was agreed. The British had believed this money was available. It was not while the invasion continued. Second, Washington blocked a separate $600 million credit from the Export Import Bank. Third, the Eisenhower administration threatened to dump its holding of pound sterling bonds on the open market, a move that, if executed, would have triggered a collapse in the pound's value and potentially forced Britain off the fixed exchange rate it had depended on to maintain its international financial position. These three moves did not leave Britain with the option of choosing between continuing the operation and facing financial consequences. They left Britain with the option of ceasing the operation or facing bankruptcy. There was no third choice. Macmillan went to the cabinet on the morning of November 6th, the same morning British forces were completing their seizure of the Canal Zone, and laid out the situation. The pound was failing. The reserves were critically depleted. The Americans would not release the IMF credit until there was a ceasefire. If Britain continued, it faced a financial crisis it could not survive. If it stopped, it faced a humiliation it might not survive politically. Eden chose to stop. He announced a ceasefire that afternoon. The military operation that had been 11 days from potentially securing the canal was halted with British forces in place along 23 miles of it. France, furious and feeling abandoned, had no choice but to follow. Israel eventually withdrew under separate American pressure. The canal stayed Egyptian. Nasser, who had been losing the military campaign, emerged from the crisis stronger than when it began. The Daily Herald's verdict on the Suez was immediate and accurate. Britain and France had been cut down to size and reduced to their status as second rate powers. It was not just a military defeat. Britain and France had won the military battle. It was the revelation of what lay beneath the surface of European power. Britain could not sustain a military operation against the opposition of the United States, not for financial reasons alone, but because the entire edifice of British global power, its reserves, its currency, its borrowing capacity, its economic position, rested on American goodwill. Remove that goodwill, and the empire was exposed as a structure built on borrowed money and borrowed time. Harold Macmillan, who replaced Eden as Prime Minister in January 1957, described the lesson with characteristic bluntness in private. In the final analysis, just as the Royal Navy could not sail without oil, Britain could not maintain its position without American goodwill. Suez made explicit what had been implicit since 1945. Britain was a client state of the United States. France drew a different, but equally consequential conclusion, where Britain responded to Suez by drawing even closer to Washington, accepting junior partnership as the price of American protection. France concluded that dependency on America was the fundamental problem. Charles de Gaulle, who returned to power in 1958, spent the next decade systematically reducing French military and financial dependency on the United States, withdrawing from NATO's integrated command, developing France's independent nuclear deterrent, and vetoing British membership into the European Economic Community on the grounds that Britain was too close to Washington to be a genuine European partner. But there was a third response to Suez that proved more durable than either the British or French individual reactions. France had already been in negotiations with West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg to create a European common market. Those negotiations had been proceeding slowly, with uncertain political will behind them. Suez changed the calculus. If European nations could be humiliated individually, if Britain alone and France alone were too weak to act without American permission, then perhaps the answer was not to remain individual. The Treaty of Rome was signed in March 1957, just 4 months after the Suez ceasefire. The 6 founding members of what would eventually become the European Union put their names on an agreement creating a European Economic Community, precisely in the aftermath of the crisis that had demonstrated most vividly what European nations could not do alone. Suez did not cause European integration, but it provided the most visceral possible argument for it. Eisenhower won completely. He stopped the invasion, preserved America's credibility with the Arab world, denied the Soviet Union its propaganda victory, and emerged from the crisis with his opposition to colonialism credentials burnishing enough to win the diplomatic goodwill he was seeking. In January 1957, he formalized what the Suez had demonstrated. The United States was now the guarantor of Middle Eastern stability, replacing Britain as the dominant external power in the region. The Eisenhower Doctrine pledged American economic and military assistance to any Middle Eastern government facing communist aggression. Washington immediately dispensed tens of millions of dollars in aid to Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Libya. The British had spent a century building their Middle Eastern position. America had replaced it in a matter of months. But Eisenhower's victory came with a cost that took decades to fully manifest. By demonstrating that the United States would not back its European allies in acts it deemed imperialistic, Suez told every government in the Middle East that Washington's support was conditional, contingent on American interest rather than alliance loyalty. By pledging support Arab governments against communist pressure, Eisenhower committed the United States to a web of Middle Eastern relationships that would entangle American foreign policy for the next 7 decades. Anthony Eden died in 1977, still believing he had been right about Nasser. History has not been kind to that verdict. What history has confirmed is that Eden was right about one thing: Suez was a watershed. He just misunderstood which way the water was flowing. It was not flowing towards a restored British position in the Middle East. It was flowing towards an America that had formally claimed the position for itself, towards a Europe that would spend the next half century trying to build the collective power that Suez had proven no individual European nation possessed alone, and towards a Middle East that had watched the two greatest empires in the world be stopped in their tracks by a phone call from Washington. The British Empire did not end at Suez, but Suez was the moment everyone stopped pretending it hadn't already ended. As one British diplomat wrote privately in the aftermath, "We are not what we were. We have not been what we were for some time. Suez was simply the moment we found out that everyone else knew."